You're crouched by a bed of coals in the gray dark before sunrise 13,000 years ago, somewhere in what's now the American Southwest. Your fingers are numb. The fire's almost out, and if it dies, so does your morning. You blow on the embers. One spark catches a curl of dry grass. Smoke stings your eyes before the flame finally takes hold, and for a second, that's the only thing in the world that matters. Somewhere close, something big is moving through the brush. You don't know yet if it's a short-faced bear or just wind dragging through tall grass. Out here, guessing wrong gets you killed. This is your morning. Not an alarm clock, not a commute. Just fire, breath, and the question of whether today you eat or you don't. You'd think a day like this was just survival. Wake up, hunt, eat, sleep, repeat. That's the version most people carry around in their heads without ever really questioning it. It's not that simple. So what did ancient Americans actually do all day? Before jobs, before clocks, before anyone had ever written down the word work, the answer involves way more idle time than you'd expect. A hunting record archaeology got almost completely backwards, and a way of living some researchers think modern people haven't matched since. These first Americans didn't leave behind a single written word. Everything we know because of what they touched, burned, and buried. Let's start with the fire, because the fire is where every single day of ancient American life actually begins. Fire wasn't a convenience. It was infrastructure. It cooked food, hardened the tips of wooden spears, kept saber-toothed cats and dire wolves at a distance, and gave a small band of people, usually somewhere between 20 and 50 of them, one warm center to wake up around. Someone in that group had almost certainly kept a coal alive overnight, banked under ash so it could be coaxed back to life at dawn instead of started from scratch. Losing your fire wasn't an inconvenience. In freezing Ice Age conditions, it could be a slow death sentence. That's the first layer of the answer nobody expects. An enormous amount of daily ancient human life was spent on maintenance. Keeping fire alive, keeping tools sharp, keeping hides from rotting. Survival wasn't one dramatic hunt. It was 100 small, repeated tasks that had to happen every single day, or the group didn't make it to the next one. Archaeologists studying sites like Paisley Caves in Oregon, where researcher Dennis Jenkins and his team found 14,000-year-old human waste preserved in dry cave sediment, can actually reconstruct diet and daily habits from what people left behind without ever meaning to. That's how much of this science works. Not grand ruins, garbage, ash, and broken tools. Once the fire's going and the coals are checked, the second task of the morning starts. Figuring out what everyone eats today. And this is where the popular picture of a caveman with a spear starts to fall apart. Here's the thing nobody tells you about prehistoric life in the Americas. Hunting a mammoth was rare. Gathering was constant. Most calories in most hunter-gatherer diets, across most of human evolution, came from plants. Roots, seeds, nuts, tubers, not from chasing megafauna across the plains. So, while a few members of the band might be preparing for a hunt, most of the group is doing something far less cinematic. Walking a familiar route through the landscape, checking which plants are ready, which berries have ripened, which roots are worth digging. That work usually fell to a mix of people, often women, older children, and elders too experienced to waste on a risky chase. Grinding seeds on stone slabs called manos and metates, slabs archaeologists have pulled out of sites across the Southwest still faintly polished from use. It's slow, repetitive, unglamorous labor. It's also the reason the group doesn't starve in the 3 weeks between successful big-game kills. Gathering wasn't the backup plan. Hunting was. Now here's a loop worth holding on to, because we're coming back to it. For decades, archaeologists assumed hunting was strictly men's work, and gathering was strictly women's. In 2018, a burial in the Andes quietly broke that assumption apart. We'll get to why in a few minutes. For now, picture the hunting party. Because their morning looks completely different, a hunt didn't start with running. It started with tracking. Reading a scuffed hoofprint, broken grass stems, the particular smell of a wallow where bison antiquus had bedded down the night before. Ancient Americans read landscape the way you read a phone screen. Instantly, constantly, without even registering they're doing it. When they finally closed in, the weapon of choice usually wasn't a spear thrown by hand. It was an atlatl, a spear thrower, a simple hooked stick that acts like a lever, extending the arm and roughly doubling the speed and force behind a dart, tipped with a carefully napped stone point. The kind archaeologists now call Clovis points, first identified near Clovis, New Mexico, in the 1930s. That dart could bring down an animal weighing 10 times what any human could lift. Sites like Naco and Leaner in Arizona, and Domebo in Oklahoma, preserve exactly this moment frozen in the dirt. Mammoth bones surrounded by fluted stone points, evidence of a kill that fed a band for days, sometimes weeks. But a successful mammoth hunt was closer to a jackpot than a Tuesday. It was memorable specifically because it was rare. Most days, the hunt was smaller. Rabbits, birds, fish pulled from a cold stream with a weir of woven branches. Unglamorous, reliable, exactly what actually kept people alive. This is what archaeologists call a forager-collector strategy, a term coined by researcher Louis Binford. A way of organizing a group so some tasks happen close to camp, day to day, while others require longer, planned trips further out. It's not chaos, it's logistics. Somebody's deciding every morning who stays close and who ranges far, based on the season, the terrain, and what the group actually needs that week. And that decision-making brings us to something people almost never picture when they imagine ancient America. Meeting, not formal ones, but real conversation, real negotiation, real disagreement about where to go and what to do. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies. Groups like the Hadza of Tanzania, whose daily rhythms researchers like Frank Marlowe have documented for decades as a working analogy for ancient behavior, find that decisions rarely came from a single chief barking orders. They came from discussion. Older members, with deep memory of past droughts and past migrations, carried enormous authority. Because their memory was the only archive the group had, there was no book to check. There was only who remembered. That's not primitive. That's a functioning information system, built entirely out of human memory and passed voice to voice, generation to generation, which brings us to the children, because childhood in ancient America looked nothing like a modern classroom. And it also wasn't idle. Kids didn't sit through lessons. They shadowed adults, and they played, but the play itself was training. A child throwing a small, blunted dart at a piece of bark was rehearsing the exact motion an adult used to bring down a bison. A child weaving grass was rehearsing basketry. Archaeologists have found miniature tools at some sites. Smaller points, smaller scrapers. Too small to have been practical for adult hands, which strongly suggests kids were handed real materials and expected to practice on their own scale. Think about that for a second. There was no separation between learning and living. The classroom was the campsite. The curriculum was staying alive. By midday, the band's morning tasks are mostly done. Fire tended, food gathering underway, hunters out or already back. And here's where the picture gets genuinely strange to modern eyes. There was a lot of downtime, not laziness, not chaos. Actual, structured rest built into the rhythm of the day, because once the essential tasks were handled, there wasn't a boss demanding 8 more hours of labor for the sake of it. This is where we need to talk about a name for what's happening here, because it has one, and it belongs to anthropologist Marshall Sahlins. In 1966, Sahlins looked at data on hunter-gatherers around the world and proposed something that upended a century of assumptions. He called it the original affluent society. Not affluent in the sense of owning things. Affluent in the sense of having enough, and having enough time. Researcher Richard Lee's fieldwork with the Juhansi people of the Kalahari in the 1960s backed this up with real numbers. Adults spending roughly 15 to 20 hours a week on actual subsistence work. The rest went to rest, socializing, craft, and story, not a 40-hour week. Not a back-breaking grind from dawn to dusk. Closer to a part-time job, with extraordinarily high stakes attached to it. Now, ancient Americans weren't the Juhansi, and 20,000 years and an ocean apart from each other, direct comparison only goes so far. Ice Age megafauna hunting carried its own brutal risks that didn't apply everywhere else. But the underlying pattern, short bursts of high-effort labor, long stretches of maintenance and rest, almost no concept of a fixed workday, shows up again and again across hunter-gatherer archaeology worldwide, including sites right here in the Americas. If daily survival didn't eat the whole day, what filled the hours that were left? The answer is bigger than you'd think, and it's the part of ancient life we've almost completely erased from how we picture it. Afternoons were for making things, not just tools out of necessity, though there was plenty of that. Flint knapping alone could eat hours, striking a core stone with a hammerstone or a piece of antler, flake by flake, until a rough blank slowly became a lethal, symmetrical Clovis point. A skilled knapper could read a piece of chert the way a sculptor reads marble, knowing exactly where the next strike needed to land and where it absolutely couldn't get it wrong, and weeks of collected stone shattered uselessly in your hand. It's a skill ancient humans carried across continents, but almost nowhere is it more visible in the archaeological record than right here in prehistoric America. Hide working took just as long. Scraping fat and flesh from an animal's skin with a stone scraper, then softening it, then sewing it into clothing or shelter covering using bone needles and sinew thread. Some of the oldest sewing needles ever found in North America, discovered at sites tied to the Buttermilk Creek complex in Texas, date back more than 15,000 years. That's not a footnote. That's fashion, engineering, and survival technology, all bundled into one bone needle smaller than your finger. The one about hunting not being exclusively men's work. In 2018, at a 9,000-year-old burial site called Willamaya Pacha, high in the Andes of what's now Peru, archaeologist Randy Haas and his team uncovered a skeleton buried with a full big-game hunting toolkit. Projectile points, an animal processing kit, everything associated with a serious hunter. The skeleton was female. Not a one-off. Haas's team went back through records of other ancient American burials with hunting tools and found the ratio of likely female hunters was far higher than anyone had assumed. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of big game hunters in some of these populations. Not always men hunting, not always women gathering. A much more fluid division of labor than the story we'd all quietly accepted as fact. Think about that for a second. An assumption that shaped how museums built dioramas, how textbooks drew illustrations, how an entire century of ancient history got imagined. And it was wrong, or at least far less rigid than anyone claimed. This is one of the reasons the field of anthropology keeps circling back to re-examine old digs with new questions. The bones didn't change. The assumptions people brought to them did. By late afternoon, with tools mended and food processed, the band starts to reconvene. And this is where something happens that rarely makes it into how we picture prehistory. Real, sustained boredom-proofing. Storytelling wasn't entertainment on the side. It was the primary technology for passing down everything that mattered. Which plants were poisonous? Where the river flooded every spring? What happened the last time a drought lasted 3 years instead of 1? None of it was written down because writing didn't exist yet in the Americas. It lived entirely in memory, wrapped in stories specifically because stories are what memory holds on to. Some researchers studying Native American history and oral traditions among indigenous communities today have found stories that appear to preserve real geological and astronomical events. A flood, a volcanic eruption, even a comet, passed down with enough consistency to hint they may be genuinely ancient, carried across hundreds of generations. That's not myth for its own sake. That's a data storage system built entirely out of rhythm, repetition, and the human voice. And the sky itself was part of the same system. Long before anyone called it astronomy, ancient Americans were tracking it constantly. Which stars rose before the first frost, which position of the sun meant it was time to move camp toward a salmon run or away from a coming winter. This is what archaeologists call the seasonal round. A repeating annual pattern of moving the whole band between resource-rich locations, timed by the sky and by memory, not by any calendar written on a wall. It predates agriculture. It predates permanent settlements. It predates the very idea of staying in one place for more than a season. As the light faded and the fire got fed for the night, that's when a lot of the actual craftsmanship of ancient American life happened. Not grinding survival, but something closer to what we'd now call art. Red ochre, a mineral pigment, shows up again and again at ancient American sites, used to color tools, hides, and in at least one striking case, a burial. At a site in Montana known as Anzick, archaeologists found the remains of a young child, roughly 1 year old, dating back around 12,900 years, buried beneath a thick layer of red ochre alongside more than 100 stone and bone tools. A 2014 genetic study led by researcher Eski Willerslev confirmed that child's DNA connects directly to many indigenous peoples across North and South America today. A living genetic thread stretching from that fireside burial straight into the present. That burial wasn't functional. Nobody needed 100 tools in the afterlife. It was grief, ritual, and love expressed in the only permanent language available: stone, ochre, and bone. Not a footnote to survival, proof that survival was never the whole story. So let's pull all of this together, because by now the shape of an actual day should be pretty different from the one you probably walked in with wake before dawn. Tend the fire. Eat something already prepared, or gather quickly nearby. Split into tasks based on skill and need, not rigid gender roles. Hunt occasionally, gather constantly, process and mend for hours. Rest when the essential work is done. Teach children through play instead of lecture. Gather again at dusk for food, memory, and story, not a grind. Not leisure, either. Something in between that doesn't have a clean modern equivalent, because modern life doesn't really have anything structured quite like it. Here's the twist that undercuts almost everything popular culture has fed us about the caveman life. For a huge stretch of human evolution, including the earliest chapters of ancient American history, people likely worked fewer hours at actual subsistence tasks than the average person clocks at a desk job today, not because life was easy. Ice Age predators were real. Injury without modern medicine could be fatal. Famine from a bad season could wipe out a band entirely. But the day-to-day structure, hours worked, hours rested, hours spent simply being with other people, wasn't the nonstop grind it gets flattened into. Not constant danger, not constant leisure, a tight high-stakes balance between the two, repeated every single day for thousands of years before anyone ever needed a word for job. And that word never even existed for most of this stretch of ancient history. There was no wage, no boss, no clock to punch. There was only the group, the season, and the honest question of what needed doing today to make tomorrow possible. We know all of this because of an extraordinary run of discoveries that keeps getting deeper. Footprints preserved in ancient lakebed mud at White Sands, New Mexico, dated in a landmark 2021 study to over 21,000 years ago, show children running, playing, splashing through puddles alongside adults. Not working, just being kids, footprints frozen in place for over 20,000 years. Underwater at a site called Page Ladson in Florida, divers have pulled up stone tools and butchered mastodon bone dated to around 14,500 years ago. evidence of a hunt carried out on ground that's now 15 feet below a Florida river. And far to the south, at Monteverde in Chile, researcher Tom Dillahay's decades of work uncovered wooden structures, medicinal plants, and even preserved chewed seaweed, a level of everyday domestic detail almost never preserved this far back, showing people fully settled in, living full lives, not simply passing through. Every one of these sites tells the same underlying story from a different angle. This wasn't a thin scattering of desperate survivors barely holding on. This was full, rich, complicated human life. People who laughed, argued, taught their kids, buried their dead with love, and organized their days around something that actually resembled balance. Here's the thing worth sitting with as you close this out. Every single ancestor in that chain, every fire kept alive through an Ice Age night, every mammoth hunt, every ochre burial, had to succeed every single day for you to exist at all. One missed hunt, one fire that didn't catch, one bad decision about which way to travel for winter, and that entire line ends. It didn't end. Not once, not across more than 20,000 years of prehistory in the Americas. That's not a small thing. That's an unbroken chain of first Americans, of Paleo-Indians, of ordinary people making thousands of small, correct decisions across an unimaginable stretch of Ice Age time. So the next time an alarm clock drags you out of bed for a job that didn't exist for 99% of human history, remember what actually filled a day before jobs were invented. Not endless toil, not carefree wandering. Just fire, food, family, and the quiet, repeated work of getting to tomorrow. The same work every ancient American did, long before anyone thought to call it work at all. Somewhere under a highway, a farm field, or a quiet stretch of American wilderness, the ash from one of those fires is probably still there, packed into the dirt, still warm with a story nobody ever had to write down to keep alive.